The shoreline management policy of the National Trust was developed back in 2005 and stated that it will work with natural processes wherever practicable. This thinking is now being implemented on many coastal projects. It challenges people's traditional thinking about how our coast is managed.
This is called the Brownsea Shoreline Restoration Project, and it was conceived about 2 or 3 years ago when we decided that the defences on the south shore of Brownsea Island were in a fairly poor state of repair. They had done their time, and therefore they were not really actually adding to the defences of the island in terms of preventing erosion. We have been very fortunate in receiving some grant money from Natural England and also some separate money from DEFRA to carry out this work and to actually record how we do it. So it's an example, if you like, of quite an unusual situation, an exit strategy for failed sea defences.
Brownsea Island is a 500-acre island in the middle of Poole Harbour. It's the largest of the 5 reasonable sized islands in the harbour. It's owned by the National Trust. We lease part of the island to Dorset Wildlife Trust and they manage it as a nature reserve. We also lease the castle on the island to John Lewis Partnership and they manage that as a hotel for their partners to come and visit. The island is a triple SI, a Site of Special Scientific Interest. It's in an area of outstanding natural beauty, Poole Harbour. It's a nature reserve, it's a place people come to visit because it's tranquil, it's beautiful. You can come and visit for the day from Poole or from the sandbanks on a boat, and you can walk around the island. And in the south of England, if you want to see red squirrels, Brownsea is definitely the best place to come.
Well, I like it. It's adventurous, cool, and it's good to explore.
One of the things that was asked of us when we first proposed this project was, well, okay, I can understand why you want to remove all the failing defences if they're not working and they're unsightly and they're breaking up, but surely you're going to replace them with something new. And that was the point where we had to say, well, actually, no. We're not going to replace them because that would be contradictory to the idea of working with natural processes. There is no infrastructure justification to replace them.
In England and Wales, we're fortunate enough to have a public process of thinking about coastal change called shoreline management planning, and this helps us think about coastal change on not just a short-term basis but also for the longer term, so very much thinking about the 20, 50 and 100-year time horizons. Thinking in long time frames of 100 years helps us to understand environmental change. In particular, we're thinking about sea level rise, and for Poole Harbour what this means is that we're seeing at the moment a sea level rise of perhaps 3 millimetres a year, which means 30 centimetres over the next 100 years.
Scientists actually predict that the sea level rise figures could be double the original projections, but the Trust has allowed for that in their calculations.
We're trying to allow for a level of water rise here in Poole of around about 1 metre. Hopefully it won't be that much, but at least our plans and our designs and our policies will allow for up to 1 metre of sea level rise over the next 100 years.
There were 2 main groups of people that we needed to be concerned about and to incorporate and consider and basically win over to the fact that we actually believed that this was the right thing to do. One critical group was actually a group of donors that during the 70s and 80s had contributed quite a lot of money to put the defences in the first place. So we got a communication plan to speak to those people if they were still interested. And then the other big group was all our own volunteers, many of whom have been involved on the island for 50 years. And so again, have been very part of that whole mentality where you defend the coast rather than actually remove sea defences.
If you look around the coastline of England and Wales, you'll often see gabion baskets, wooden groins, old bits of concrete wall, which have clearly failed and are not doing very much, but they're still there because either the local authority or the landowner either has decided they can't be bothered, or more likely that it would cost too much money to remove them, proactively remove them. Well, the Trust didn't take that point of view. The choices we had was twofold. One, to let them just continue to deteriorate, to become more and more unsightly, and of course also dangerous, particularly the wooden palisades. It could have been a situation where those wooden piles broke off, floated off into the channel, and could have been a navigational hazard. And if that had happened, we could have very much seen ourselves in trouble with Poole Harbour Commissioners, because obviously anything that's a hazard to navigation, if we were responsible for that, we would be culpable if there was an accident. So there was also, if you like, a practical reason for wanting to remove those defences and allow that piece of coastline to look more natural and to behave in a more natural fashion. We will get a much more accurate locational map produced.
The Inception meeting was really to work out what we needed to do. Well, we knew we had quite a lot to do in addition to physically removing the sea defences, which is where we had some money already from our higher level scheme from Natural England. But this was to plan all the work that needed to be done to get to the point where they could be removed. So all the permissions, working with the Poole Harbour Commissioners, local authority like the Purbeck District Council, and all the communication work, everything around that, we needed to plan that basically and get a plan of action sorted. We're very lucky because there's a very active group in the Poole Harbour area. It's actually called the Poole Harbour Heritage Trust. And we do have a few of the members of that who volunteer on Brownsea, and they became the core of a group of very dedicated people who have done a lot of the monitoring of particularly the archaeological remains that we have particularly on the south shore of the island.
With the watching brief, which we've started earlier in the year, we're going along the shoreline, recording the features as they are before the shoreline defences are being removed, and the object of that is to record periodically erosion that occurs and record the features that are coming out of the cliff. This will give a cross-section of the development hopefully, and be able to give a better interpretation of what we've got down there, because it's not clearly understood dates and periods of work.
We're coming over and we're walking around features that we've already identified as at risk of erosion, and we are photographing them with ranging poles with the scale on them, and we are then keeping an archive of it, and every 6 months perhaps do another survey depending on how it's eroding. Because we've seen already from over the last 12 months that certain features are eroding a lot more quickly than others.
Well, I think we all struggle with change, but attitudes are changing as we learn more about sea level rise and what it means in terms of climate change. People are becoming more familiar with the subject, and attitudes are changing, and realisation that we've got to be more adaptive in the future.
I think to have the coastline sorted out would be really great, get rid of some of these awful eyesores like the iron girders, etc. And I think it's a really, really good thing that they're doing.
I don't believe if you take bits away from round the back here, anything will happen. We might be able to have to moor our boat in somewhere slightly different, but who cares, you know, it's still a lovely place to come.
Brownsea Island has over 100,000 visitors every year, and this had to be taken into account.
We arranged for the project to take place outside opening hours, so early in the season before we opened and late in the season after we'd closed. So all this, the removal of the wooden piles took place in February, and now the steelworks are going out in November, so it's outside the open season of the island. And the other issue is health and safety, the huge big excavators and skips trundling around the island. It would have been too dangerous really having the public here. So we made sure that the project, had as small an effect as possible on people's experience when they're on Brownsea Island.
So what we then needed to do, having got the permissions in place, was the usual procedure of going for tenders to find a contractor who knew how to work on the foreshore in a relatively hostile engineering environment and could remove these materials safely, effectively, and obviously comply with all H&S and also with recycling issues.
We started the first part of the job in March last year, and we removed the stone-filled gabion baskets and the timber piles, the 2,600 timber piles along the shoreline. That was phase one in the spring. A lot of the gabion baskets had old pottery shards inside them. They were removed from the baskets and then placed on the beach on existing areas of pottery shards. Unfortunately, that wasn't right by where the actual baskets were, so they had to be put into track dumpers and carried several hundred metres along the shoreline to find existing places of shards to add onto there.
Our aspiration really was to follow the management principles that the Trust developed in the period 2004-2005, which basically said we would like to work with natural processes wherever practicable. It meant actually proactively removing these failing defences. Our scheme that's just completing now sits very comfortably into that model, into that shoreline management plan model, which says, having done the removal of the defences, we are now in a strong position to allow that shoreline management plan policy of no active intervention to run comfortably for the next 100 years.
This autumn we've done the removal of the steel piles. Pleasant surprises, thankfully. The rule of thumb on steel piling is 2/3 in the ground and 1/3 out. We've actually found half in and half out, so there was actually less steel and it's come out a bit easier than worst case scenario, so quite pleased with that. The steel will be taken offshore via the BP barge and will be recycled. There's a local recycling facility in Poole that will take the steel. One of the biggest things really was working here on Brownsea Island, the remoteness of it, the fact that you've got to come prepared, and in the event of a problem or a machine breakdown, everything's going to take a lot longer to sort out.
Well, it's very truly said that without the support of a lot of other organisations and a lot of other individuals, this project perhaps would have been a lot more complicated and more difficult to manage and more difficult to complete.
I was amazed in February how quickly Alaska, the contractors, took the piles out. It was, very, very quick, very efficient. They've been fantastic all the way through. They regraded the cliffs and the slopes, so you couldn't even tell that they'd been there. Everything seemed to mesh together very well. We've had very limited impact on the island, very limited impact on the public, none at all. Volunteers and the staff on the island, everything just seemed to work very well.
So looking at the Brownsea project, we have to recognise it as a real success. And I think it is a real success. It's about demonstrating ways in which we can use interesting and new techniques of managing coastal change. So in this instance, the removal of failed sea defences has helped to restore the natural processes. And this in itself is going to help Brownsea and the shoreline on Brownsea cope with future change through sea level rise.
The immediate benefit is that we've restored the beauty of the coastline. So for anybody coming to the island, there's now a very beautiful, natural looking coastline. It's also a safe one. Longer term, because of all the recording and the success of the project, we've got a story to tell about the project itself and how it's worked. We've got another element to the story of Brownsea which we will be using and telling in the future.
Well, it's looking absolutely wonderful. It really is. It's unspoilt. It's looking very neat.
Personally, yes, I prefer something that does look much more natural. Having said that, safety is always an issue as well. So if the two things work together, then that's obviously a win-win, isn't it?